My name is Dawn Nickel, and along with my daughter Taryn Strong, I am the founder of the She Recovers Foundation. When I reflect on what this past 6 or 7 months of the pandemic has meant for me individually as a woman in long-term recovery, what I am most astonished by is how I have learned that I can hold so very many different emotions at one time. To feel fear in one moment, and maybe in that same moment or the next moment, feel hope. To feel boredom and feel overwhelmed. To feel so angry and yet feel happy and joyful. I have no idea why the world is as it is today. There's so much tragedy around us. But I do know this, just as I learned early in my recovery, that there was going to be a brighter day. I know that today. And feelings, well, just like they haven't killed me in the last 30 years, I know they're not going to kill me today. I'm just going to keep on feeling them, letting them come in, letting them go out. Most of all, I feel gratitude.
Resilience. It's the process of adapting in the face of adversity. It's what helps someone like Dawn to see hope amidst the fear of this season. So what makes one person more or less resilient than someone else? And how are doctors and researchers working to predict a person's level of risk and resilience before trauma happens? The COVID-19 pandemic is more than a story about a severe, acute respiratory syndrome. It's a story about us and the ways this global event is changing our minds, our relationships, and our communities. I'm David Condos, and this is In Practice, the story of the other pandemic, the one that's happening between our ears. Episode 3, The Tipping Point.
In Practice is brought to you by Meadows Behavioral Healthcare, a trusted name in trauma and mental health treatment. To offer the most clinically comprehensive program possible, the Meadows assembled a hand-picked team of senior fellows, like Dr. Dayton. With their groundbreaking research and expertise, these senior fellows help shape the Meadows evidence-based approach to healing. Learn more at meadowsbh.com.
The hard thing about COVID-19 pandemic is it's an ongoing trauma without an end in sight.
That's Dr. Farha Abbasi. She's a professor of psychiatry at Michigan State University and founder of the Muslim Mental Health Consortium. And she says any conversation around mental health resilience should start by looking at the multitude of stressors that affect each individual differently.
There is just so many multiple layers of trauma happening right now, from financial losses to emotional losses to heightened relationship issues to racism. So there is no way your mental health is not going to be impacted.
But the severity of that impact largely depends on the historical, biological, and environmental factors that make up a person's trauma risk profile. It's like a fingerprint, a unique set of genetic coding, childhood experiences, coping mechanisms, and community connections. And it sets the foundation for how our brains are able to adapt when a traumatic season like this pandemic comes along. One factor that has the power to boost everyone's resilience, no matter their risk profile, is having access to appropriate, equitable care. But sadly, Dr. Abbasi says that many key aspects of the American mental health care system were on the brink of faltering even before the pandemic.
We already have huge unmet need and shrinking resources. And I think this COVID-19 pandemic and the recent events are going to be the tipping point.
One of the clearest ways to view the gravity of this issue is by looking at how many Americans face barriers when it comes to seeking help when and where they need it.
Like in Michigan, you have 33 counties without a psychiatrist.
And Michigan isn't alone. According to 2017 data from the American Medical Association, 60% of U.S. counties don't have a single psychiatrist. And for individuals who were already experiencing a mental health condition before COVID-19,
this is just going to quadruple the burden on them.
So having any type of pre-existing mental health diagnosis is one of the biggest factors in determining someone's trauma risk in this pandemic. But even for people who hadn't experienced mental health issues previously, Dr. Abbasi says the stress of this time could push them to a breaking point. According to a Pew Research Center survey from May, 1/3 of Americans reported experiencing high levels of psychological distress during the pandemic so far. And that number was even higher, around 50%, for respondents who reported having a poor financial situation or a physical disability that prevented them from participating in activities. And Dr. Abbasi expects some of the people experiencing distress now to feel lasting psychological effects. This could include new cases of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder,
or what I'm calling post-pandemic stress disorder. On top of all other challenges, everybody has this anticipatory anxiety going on, like what the post-COVID-19 life or career or finances or relationship, what is the society even gonna look like? We don't know yet. So unconsciously, consciously, your body, your mind does not even know what to get ready for.
As you heard in the previous episode, PTSD is a mental health condition that can develop after someone experiences a single traumatic event, like an assault, or a lasting series of traumatic events, like living through a period of constant threat or uncertainty. And sadly, experiencing PTSD is not particularly uncommon. According to the American Psychiatric Association, 1 out of every 11 people will be diagnosed with PTSD at some point in their life. And like Dr. Abbasi, many of the experts I've talked with are concerned about the pandemic's potential to fuel post-traumatic stress. But right now, as we're in the midst of navigating this pandemic, Dr. Tion Dayton says we're more likely to be experiencing a similar condition called pre-trauma.
Which means that people are experiencing similar symptoms to post-trauma, but in anticipation.
Dr. Dayton is a clinical psychologist who specializes in trauma and adverse childhood experiences in New York. She's a former professor of psychodrama at NYU who now serves as a senior fellow with the Meadows.
So with anticipatory grief, we're worrying, we're grieving, we're anxious about what could happen. So we're grieving what we don't know yet and what we've already lost.
She says that the good news is that it's not too late to heal these pre-trauma symptoms before they develop into PTSD.
If we can get those processed right away, now as they happen, we will go a long way to preventing a lasting trauma that becomes a post-traumatic stress.
But of course, that's dependent on someone's ability to access appropriate mental health care when they need it. And one big downside of experiencing pre-trauma stress in the middle of an ongoing traumatic event is that the event itself is still unfolding in an unpredictable way. Dr. Dayton says that even just feeling uncertainty in our routines can impact our trauma risk. In the world of psychology, this type of routine disruption is described as the weekend phenomenon. Basically, it's a way to frame how our brains benefit from the inherent structure that comes with a typical weekday.
During the week, that natural anxiety is kind of organized and bound. You belong somewhere, you know the routine, you know when your breaks are, you know when your work times are, you know the expectations, they are clear.
The routines related to having a job, a home, and a community help us organize our thoughts and the way we view the world.
But when the weekends come, our routines are more up to us. They're not there in the same regulated and regular way.
As Dr. Dayton says, the lack of structure isn't inherently good or bad, but it is disruptive. It puts even more pressure on us to hold things together. And in this pandemic weekend, nobody knows when we'll get to the next proverbial Monday.
We like to know what to expect. We like the world to feel predictable. We like storylines. We like things with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Now, in COVID-19, that is all turned on its head. We don't know what's coming next. We can't predict, and we are very uncertain. And that's anxiety-provoking.
With all of these factors converging, a looming wave of new mental health diagnoses might seem like a foregone conclusion. But Professor Neil Greenberg doesn't see it that way.
In fact, I don't think it tells you any of that at all.
Professor Greenberg is a psychiatrist and researcher specializing in trauma in hostile environments. He teaches at King's College London in the United Kingdom, and he's also a past president of the UK Psychological Trauma Society.
I think if you take any group of people who are in the middle of a crisis or a difficult situation, that it's quite adaptive, quite normal to have mental health symptoms. Those symptoms aren't necessarily indicative that someone's unwell, and they're not necessarily indicative that actually people are going to have long-term mental health difficulties as a result of this pandemic.
Back in February of 2020, just as COVID-19 was emerging in the Western world, Professor Greenberg and his colleagues at King's College London decided to take a closer look at this. They wanted to know how a period of forced social separation during this pandemic might affect us. So they looked at thousands of pieces of research and ended up reviewing 24 different studies on people who had experienced quarantine during past pandemics. These ranged from a SARS outbreak in Toronto to Ebola spreading through villages of Sierra Leone. After analyzing all that data, they released a new rapid review study about the psychological effects of quarantine. And here's what they concluded. While having your life disrupted by a pandemic is distressing across the board, if that type of social separation was done well, it didn't generally leave a lasting psychological impact.
But if it was done badly, then what was quite surprising for us is it wasn't just a cause of short-term frustration and annoyance. Actually, it could cause some long-term mental health problems in terms of depression and also post-traumatic stress symptoms. And actually, that could go on for months or even years.
And Professor Greenberg's team found a few common threads that seem to determine a person's risk for experiencing those lasting symptoms.
First of all, people have to understand the rationale for the quarantine.
And that understanding requires responsive, clear communication from health experts and government officials. And that, unfortunately, has not always been the case during this pandemic.
The second thing is that people needed to feel that their basic needs were met.
So when someone isn't able to get their food, medicine, or other things their family needs, that increases their risk for lasting trauma. And sadly, the economic impact of this pandemic has cast a wide net of financial stress.
If you've got a job that involves you, driving a taxi or opening a shop, you're not only losing contact with people, you're also losing money.
And Professor Greenberg says the financial impact and other secondary ramifications of the pandemic could cause even more psychological harm than isolation or anxiety about the virus itself.
Well, as I say, I think the biggest impacts on mental health are going to be ones that sadly we already know about, which is poverty, domestic violence, and people who have got chronic health disorders that haven't been treated well because of the crisis.
From early in my career, I was really interested in the fact that people can experience similar traumatic events, and some people will develop PTSD and other people won't.
Dr. Keristin Conan is a professor of psychiatric epidemiology. She studies trauma at the Harvard University T.H. Chan School of Public Health. You heard from her in the previous episode as well. She spent the past several years studying why people who experience the same traumatic event, like a natural disaster, go on to experience different levels of lasting trauma. And her research gives her hope about our post-pandemic future.
When we look at other disasters, the majority of people tend to be quite resilient. So I'm one of the people who said this could be a mental health disaster, but that doesn't mean it will be, and there doesn't mean there isn't a lot people are doing individually or communities can do that would prevent a long-term adverse mental health impact.
But she agrees with Professor Greenberg about the potential for COVID-related financial stress to cause long-term mental health issues.
That's what my long-term worries in terms of mental health are probably most related to the economic consequences of the pandemic. And how long they last, I think, will really have a big influence on whether people's current distress turns into more of long-term mental health problems or sort of rebounds and people go back to normal.
But external factors like financial stability and social support aren't the only things influencing our trauma risk. Dr. Conan and her team at Harvard have also been studying the biological connections between our unique genetic makeup and our risk for trauma.
So PTSD is what we call heritable, meaning it's influenced by our genetic makeup, just like in the same way schizophrenia is or major depression is.
In one study, she and her team examined the connections between genetics and trauma outcomes for 65 different groups of participants, some of which included up to 100 individuals from all over the world. In analyzing the data from these participants, her team searches for genes that might help predict risk or resilience on a biological level. And it's somehow even more complex than it sounds.
One thing we've learned about the genetics of PTSD, which is true of the genetics of any mental disorder, is that it's complicated. And what that means is that there's no sort of silver bullet. There's no like one gene or handful of genes that are going to predict who gets PTSD or not. Risk is determined by very small effects of many different genes across the whole genome.
A better understanding of genomics and the biology of trauma could help doctors learn which type of treatment is most likely to help someone before they try it. So trauma treatment would become less of a guessing game. And Dr. Conan says the potential advancements that could come from this research aren't limited to pharmaceuticals.
It could be for behavioral treatment too. It could be that, people with a certain profile of genetics and environmental factors for certain kinds of trauma, we show that those people really benefit best from cognitive behavioral therapy first.
But she says don't expect some kind of trauma risk score with the results of your next Ancestry DNA kit. Even as researchers like Dr. Conan discover new possibilities for trauma treatment, they also make new discoveries about just how complex the brain is.
What the field would love to be able to do is after a traumatic event, be able to predict, have some measure where you could easily predict, okay, this person's going to develop PTSD and this person's not. And we're still trying to figure that out.
Another risk factor that looms large in this conversation is our personal history. Dr. Dayton from the Meadows has spent the past 3 decades studying the effects of childhood trauma. In this context, psychologists refer to things like childhood abuse or neglect as adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. The term originates from a landmark survey conducted by the CDC and Kaiser Permanente. It followed over 17,000 participants for several years beginning in the mid-90s. And its results established some of the first direct links between the amount of trauma experienced in childhood and the severity of physical and mental health issues later in life. Dr. Dayton says the trauma we experience in childhood, even if we aren't really aware of those experiences years later, could be triggered by the events of this pandemic.
Think of a building with a beam or a sustaining post that is rotting. That means if the weight gets too heavy in the building, it's more likely to cave in a certain area.
Dr. Dayton also sees parallels between the trauma of the pandemic and her decades of work with dysfunctional families. She says that living through a series of unexpected, evolving, terrible challenges has some overlap with the experience of a child who grows up around addiction or abuse.
In a home that's in chaos, that's unpredictable, you can't get yourself organized for a particular result because the result doesn't really depend on your actions. The result depends on the mood of the parent, right? And this virus has its own mood.
And to make matters worse, she also believes that many of the leaders and information sources that we look to during a time like this often aren't providing the stability we need.
In this case, many leaders are basing the information they're giving about the disease on what's best politically. And I'm not saying those aren't valid concerns. I would say the economy is a concern, but that doesn't mean we should be misled into thinking things are safe when they aren't. That's what the drunk parent does. No problem here. Don't worry. We're fine. I'm speeding. Have fun. I'm a lot of fun. What's wrong with you? Or you're the one who's crazy for wearing a mask. That's the experience of the child in a home that is living with addiction or trauma or violence or neglect.
And that can have lasting results, not just for each of us personally, but also for this family that we call America.
We're all experiencing collective grief in the country and in the world. However, we're not experiencing it similarly. Big parts of our country are in denial. Big parts of our country are in shock. We're factioned. And unfortunately, when leaders, the same as with parents, when they choose favorites, whether that goes with the dysfunctional family or the dysfunctional country, then the family or the country splits into factions. And if they can't communicate, they become embedded factions. And just going back to a family model, those factions can last a lifetime.
So how do we avoid this dire prediction? What are the steps we can take individually and collectively to increase our resilience and come out of this season stronger and more connected than before? For Dr. Farha Abbasi of Michigan State, it comes back to a central concept of Islam. It teaches that our individual wellness flows into welfare for others.
The idea is a healthy individual will have more healthy relationships. And a healthy relationship will lead to healthy families. Healthy families would lead to healthy communities, and then healthy communities lead to healthy society. So every act that you do for your wellness is also then connected to an act of welfare.
Dr. Abbasi says that when we prioritize the mental health needs of each person, it helps our communities to be more resilient to traumatic events on a broad scale. And she warns that we need to find ways to bring attention to mental health now, even with all the other critical issues happening in the world.
So in the end, it comes back to one thing. There are a lot of problems in the society or in the system, but unless we bring mental health central, not something you think about later or on the fringes, unless we focus on that, we will not be able to have healthy society.
Professor Neil Greenberg from King's College London agrees. He says the strength of our community bonds will go a long way in determining how we're able to bounce back from any trauma we experience now.
Because actually resilience often doesn't lie in individuals, it often lies between them.
And the more we combat isolation and seek to maintain healthy connections with those around us, the better we can recover.
The biggest single factor, I think, that makes a difference in terms of people's recovery from traumatic or challenging events is the ability to actively engage with the recovery process and not to avoid. So it's a bit of a cheesy phrase, but avoiding avoidance is really the aim of the game.
That could be as simple as reaching out to talk about how you're feeling with a friend, family member, or someone you trust. Or it could mean contacting your health provider or calling a helpline.
The biggest challenge is that people don't do any of those things. They kind of close their eyes, they try and not talk about it, they try and bottle it up, and somehow imagine that it will just go away.
But Professor Greenberg says that based on his research and others, that's not how PTSD works.
What we know is that if trauma is not recovering within a month, and pretty well recovered by 3 months, that's the time that you should be going to seek help.
But he says when we come together to support each other's recovery, that has the power to overcome the factions between us and build our collective resilience for the future.
So actually, however poorly prepared someone or a nation was, however terrible their situation was during COVID, the thing that is going to make the biggest difference to the mental health of a community going forward is actually that recovery period, and actually making sure that rather than having fractured debates about who was right and who was wrong, the idea is how do we pull together to create some sort of greater good. And I appreciate that sounds all very aspirational, but actually the evidence is that if you can properly support people afterwards and you can give them some sort of meaning to what's happened rather than just say it was a terrible set of months or weeks, then actually then the psychological outcome can not just be okay, but actually a lot of people can grow as a result. And there's this concept called post-traumatic growth, which is the fact that anything that doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So many people who have been through some really challenging times rather than come out of it as a broken individual, may well come out of it as actually someone who can be rightly proud and feel more resilient when they face adversity in the future.
In order to come back from this, it's going to take all of us. But as we look forward to building a new normal, it's important to acknowledge the flaws of the old normal. For many people in Black and Indigenous communities, this season has exacerbated long-standing disparities. So how does multi-generational trauma from centuries of oppression and systemic failures in healthcare impact people today? And how are advocates and providers working to serve the critical mental health needs of these communities?
For most communities of color, when the world gets a cold, we get the flu. And we don't have those resources to kind of tackle those problems.
I think we need to ask communities, if we're working like in the middle of any Indigenous community, any Black community, what do they identify as the issues? Not what do I identify, what do they identify as the issues? What do they identify as the needs?
A lot of us are grieving, a lot of us are in shock, a lot of us people are in disbelief. People navigate grief in a variety of different ways. Grief shows up in many ways for people in the street, right? They're angry. That is one way grief can show up. And I think we will continue to see more grief as the pandemic continues and as this crisis that we're experiencing in the country continues.
That's coming up next time on In Practice. So how are you feeling? What things are you struggling with right now? What questions do you have about how crisis impacts your brain and what you can do about it? Let me know via the contact form at inpracticepodcast.org, and I'll do my best to find answers to your questions too. This episode was reported, produced, and sound designed by me, David Condos, with original music by Adam Bokesh. You can find links to all the research referenced in this episode in the show notes of your podcast app and on the In Practice website. Finally, thank you for listening. Please leave us a review on your podcast app, spread the word about the show to your friends, and subscribe so you'll be the first to know when our new episodes come out. Until next time, stay safe and be well.